entrepreneurial, leadership, intellectual. This is the Cultural Connections Podcast.
And hello, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections Podcast. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to remind all of our viewers at home that we are recording this episode live on Friday, October 25th, 2024. And this episode is being live streamed to YouTube. So, therefore, if you have a question for our guest, please feel free to comment below, and we'll do our best to answer the question for you live. Before I go further, I want to tell viewers who have not seen our last two episodes of the podcast, these next few episodes that you're going to be seeing throughout probably the next 2 weeks are going to be focused specifically on the 5 Massachusetts ballot questions. So, yesterday and October 24th, which was Thursday, and Wednesday, October 23rd, we had focused in on question 4. Question 4, we had both sides on. Wednesday, we started with the no side, and then yesterday, Thursday, October 24th, we went to the yes side with that question. Today on the podcast, we are going to be moving to the next question, and that's question 5 on the on the ballot of the 5 ballot questions. That ballot question specifically states that the proposed law would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage an employer must pay a tipped worker, according to the over the course of 5 years on the following schedule. So to 64% of the state minimum wage as of on January 1st, 2025, to 73% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2026, to 82% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2027, to 91% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2028, and to 100% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2029. Joining me on the podcast today to discuss on the yes side of this question is Grace McGovern. Grace McGovern is the lead organizer of Yes on 5 and a current tipped worker in Boston. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here and talk about Yes on 5. And thank you to all the listeners for tuning in and educating yourself on important local elections.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree further. So before I go further, I'd like you just to give us a little bit of a brief introduction to who you are so our viewers can get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, so as Brian mentioned, I'm a current tipped worker in Boston, and I'm also the lead worker organizer for Yes on 5 Massachusetts. So I came into this campaign work as someone who was working full time in the industry. I work still part time at a brewery in downtown Crossing, and I've always been pretty progressive, pretty politically and involved in my communities. I've lived in the greater Boston area for the past 7 years, Mission Hill, glad to be out of Mission Hill, but Boston and surrounding areas. And I came into this campaign because I saw a chance to make really meaningful change and end a really outdated system. I also come originally from Minnesota, and the idea of sub-minimum wages just never crossed my mind because we don't practice sub-minimum wages in Minnesota. So tipped workers always make a full minimum wage, and everyone still goes out and tips. No one in Minnesota, stopped tipping. And it seems like common sense. And like I mentioned, unfortunately, a lot of the general public, unless they work in restaurants or have worked in restaurants in Massachusetts, don't know that their servers are making $6.75 an hour.
Absolutely. So my first question to you is just to give us a basic overview of this question for our viewers that really don't understand the basis of what they're being asked here. Can you give us just an overview of what this question means and what people would be voting on November 5th at the election on Tuesday, November 5th?
Absolutely. Yeah. So passing ballot question 5 would mean, as you mentioned, slowly um, taking away the practice of sub-minimum wages for tipped workers. So right now, primarily restaurant workers, but also some salon workers, get $6.75 an hour as long as their tips bring them up to a full minimum wage. So passing question 5 would make workers less reliant on tips and would make employers stop using customers as a means of subsidizing their employees' wages. So the reason we're implementing this over 5 years is so that businesses are able to mitigate the cost and it's not a shock to the system. But it's essentially the same thing as all of our other minimum wage increases in the past and sub-minimum wage increases, except for this round, we're not stopping at increasing the sub-minimum wage. We will stop once we get to 100% of the state minimum wage. Now, there's also a second part of the ballot question that extends the allowance for tip pooling to back of house workers once everyone in the establishment is brought up to a full minimum wage. So that essentially just brings Massachusetts up to federal standard. Every other state besides New York and Massachusetts in the United States allows for tip sharing with back of house, provided that the restaurant pays all their staff a full minimum wage. So this brings us up to federal standard. And, lots of restaurants, the one that I work in, already pool tips with front of house staff. So it's really just expanding the pool to include other workers who are very directly involved in your service that you're giving to customers that they're tipping on.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. So my next question, a lot of my questions, if people are watching from home, sound familiar. It's because a lot of these questions are basically similar along the lines of the questions that I have been asking to the other representatives from the other ballot questions that we talked to, for example, yesterday and Wednesday. So these questions may sound familiar to you at home watching. So my first question then to you here is that if this ballot measure were to pass on November 5th, what are the implications of this ballot measure passing?
Yeah, so the biggest change, if and when question 5 passes, is we're putting a little bit more money into the pockets of workers who need it the absolute most. Now, this ballot question passing gives the potential for all tipped workers in the state to receive a raise, even those who are claiming that the system already works for them, who are making, good money. That's fantastic. I'm so glad your hard work pays off. Even you can get a raise with this because your base wage is going to be higher and tips will still exist, especially in full service restaurants. Tipping's not going to go away anytime soon. As I mentioned, I'm from Minnesota. Tipping is alive and well there, and tipping is alive and well in the 7 other states that we've passed this. But the biggest thing that question 5 will do is put more money into the pockets of vulnerable workers and also make them less reliant on the charity of customers. So right now, customers are unknowingly subsidizing labor costs for employers through tips. Many customers, if not all, believe that their tips are an added gratuity on top of a wage, but actually it's helping the employer be allowed to legally underpay their customer-facing servers. So not only will it give people more take-home pay, we saw in the UMass Amherst policy brief about this and about its implications in Massachusetts that tipped workers will stand to earn and take home 10 to 21% more money once this passes, which, isn't necessarily a life-changing amount of money, but it would be a great impact to a lot of people. And that means that you don't have to put up with, sexual harassment, racial discrimination, any inappropriate behavior from customers because you're relying on their tip. You're less likely to put up with that if you're making a higher base wage. And also the other issues that come along with, a sub-minimum wage theft. Now you're able to track exactly how much your employer owes you every shift, every hour. You don't have to figure out how much your tips were and how much they owe you to make the difference. It's just a straightforward number that you can count on, that, the AG's office can count on, that everyone can be consistent and accountable. And really just, it makes things fair.
Absolutely. No, I can understand what you're saying. Before I go any further, I do want to again just remind all of our viewers at home that you are listening or watching the Cultural Connections podcast. We're live here on Friday, October 25th, 2024, talking about question 5, which is a proposed law here that is proposed law for here in Massachusetts that would gradually increase the minimum wage an employer must pay a tipped worker. Um, and we are joined by Grace McGovern, the lead organizer of the Yes on 5 and current tipped worker in Boston. My next question then, and if you have a question you'd like us to ask on the podcast and you're watching live on YouTube, please feel free to comment below and we'll do our best to get them answered. My next question then to you here then is I didn't hear exactly what you said with how many states have already implemented similar legislation to this. I'd be curious to understand and for you to explain to our voters, to the viewers here, what how successful has this been for these states that have already enacted this legislation, and in what has been the success rate for them, I guess is my question, and how has it worked for them?
Yeah, so we have, as I mentioned, 7 other states, and then Michigan just recently became the 8th state. We won a Supreme Court case, I believe, 2 months ago now. Um, so not quite in the implementation phase, but the 7 states that already practice one fair wage have higher rates of restaurant industry growth. They have about half the rate of poverty amongst tipped workers, and also half the rate of sexual harassment. So that's a big one that we've been talking about. And, as someone who is a young woman, I can tell you that myself and every other person I've ever talked to, young woman who works in the industry or has worked in the industry, has faced some level of sexual harassment, either by their managers, by their boss, being told to, like, sex themselves up to get more tips or appeal more to customers, or by customers themselves, telling them, assuming that a server wants to go home with them, or wants them to touch them on their back.
Mm.
And so sexual harassment is a big one, wage theft is a big one, but also just overall, the earnings are higher across the board. Um, like I said, the big thing that question 5 aims to do is to lift up workers and to make paychecks more accountable and clear and reliable, but also to put just a little bit more money into the pockets of the people who are working so hard to keep the restaurant industry going. Um, and so the restaurants in California and Minnesota and other states have much higher restaurant growth rate than Massachusetts. And all across the board, from the lowest income tipped workers in California to the highest income tipped workers in California, make more in take home pay than the lowest income workers in Massachusetts and the highest income workers in Massachusetts.
Mhm.
So, these same restaurants, especially the chains like IHOP, like Denny's, whatever it may be, have figured out how to do this without raising their prices from state to state at all. And have found that, it's profitable to pay your customer facing employees what they're owed. The entire rest of the state has decided that $15 is the floor, is the absolute minimum for what we will pay an employee for their labor. And then we've said tipped workers have to start below that and work themselves up to get $15 an hour. So, in a situation where you're treating people fairly and you're treating people like every other employee in the state, you have much lower rates of turnover. So that leads to, like I mentioned, the restaurant growth rate. It leads to higher employee satisfaction. And all of these things will end up being good for the businesses themselves because, again, these tipped workers are the customer facing employees. These tipped workers are the ones, are your salespeople, they're your marketing people, they're the face of your establishment. They're the ones who have to pitch the menu items and tell your customers about it. They're the ones who have to solve any problems that your customers have. They're the ones who have to put on a happy face no matter what happened to them that day. And so giving them more respect and giving them more consistency in their pay is going to make them happier, is going to make them feel more respected at their job. And in turn, you're going to see that investment come back into a better environment in your business and eventually more profits in your business.
Absolutely. No, I hear what you're saying, and I think that makes sense here. Then my next question then to you here is, and I think this has been something obviously as we've seen recently, especially these past couple of weeks from a national attention, is minimum wage, and the discussion of minimum wage in general. And obviously, I know it goes back and forth between a state minimum wage and a federal minimum wage. If I mean, how I'm curious to understand how if the federal minimum wage were to get increased, and we know we've heard discussions, we've heard this from both sides of the aisle in the political spectrum, and by any means, I'm not getting into a political discussion on the federal minimum wage and who's right versus wrong on that. But how would that change the results of this the results of this moving forward if, let's say, down the road the federal minimum wage were to rise, and what would that do for tipped workers like yourself? How would that change things? Would that do anything?
So if the minimum wage increases without the sub minimum wage increasing, which usually in the past, if there's a federal minimum wage increase, the sub minimum wage follows. But if the minimum wage continues to increase and the sub minimum wage does not, that means that you're giving up more and more of your tips to your employer to make up the difference between sub minimum wage and the minimum wage.
Mm,
Because we've decided what the very least that you could take home is after an hour of labor. But if you have access to tips and you're working your butt off to receive tips from customers and the minimum
right,
wage keeps going up, you just have to give more and more of that to your boss to make up the difference between the floor of 675, which is what your employer is paying you. So
right,
as it stands right now, $15 an hour is not really enough for anyone to live, but employers are paying 675 an hour. And if you get, at least the difference in tips, and just let's say you break even, you make, with tips, you make $15 an hour. That means that the employer's paying you 675, and then the customer is paying, or you're paying out of your tips, however you want to look at it, 825. So it's not even a 50-50 split. You're essentially tipping out your employer and paying him to let you go to work at his establishment. And the more the minimum wage raises without the sub minimum wage being addressed, it's gonna mean you have to work harder just to break even and to ever see any of your actual tips.
I see. That makes sense. Then my next question then to you here is in what I said at the very beginning of the podcast when I explained the question is that this is over the course of 5 years. Again, according to the following schedule, that at to 64% of the state minimum wage on January 1st, 2025, to 73% by January 1st, 2026, 82% by January 1st, 2027, and to 91% by January 1st, 2028, and to 100% by January 1st, 2029. Does it remain at that after the 5 year period? What's going to happen after the 5 year period? Is it going to remain consistently for the years after that down the road at 100%? How is it guaranteed to stay at 100%
It's
after the 5 year period?
So this is a ballot question to end the practice of sub minimum
Right.
wages. And the only reason there's a 5-year implementation is so that there's not a giant shock to the restaurant industry. So these small businesses that we're worried about and love so much and want to see thrive, so that
Mm-hmm.
they can make shift happen without insane menu and cost increases right, as soon as January 1st comes. But once we're at 5 years, once we are at 100% of the minimum wage, then we are tied to that minimum wage. If the minimum wage goes up, then we're being paid a minimum wage. So our wages go up.
Okay. Now, what I try to if we it says here obviously from the voters guide here that there is really no physical fiscal consequences to the Commonwealth or any municipalities on behalf of passing something like this. Are there any? I mean, basically, if it's not in that context, but is there any fiscal consequences by something like this getting passed? And if so, what would be any type of consequence if something like this were to pass?
Again, the consequences are people getting paid what they're owed.
Yeah.
The consequences are low wage low income workers having a little bit more money in their pockets, and in turn, a little bit more disposable income to put back into the Commonwealth. And also, tipped workers, restaurant workers are the best tippers. I always joke that my cash tips never leave the street that I work on. Like my cash tips, as soon as I pick them up, they are going directly into the hands of another tipped worker who's cracking my beer for me after my shift. Uh, and I think, again, if we're doing the 5-year implementation, I think it would be very difficult for a lot of these small mom and pop places to make the change were it overnight. They had to increase their wages by $8.25. The first year is just over a $2 increase. And so to that, I would say, if restaurant owners really cannot figure out how to operate a profitable business without underpaying a certain portion of their staff, then I would argue they shouldn't be in business. You're not a good business person if your
Right.
profitability is tied to your ability to legally underpay some of your staff, the people who are selling your goods, the people who are customer facing employees. Um, and so calling it back again to the UMass Amherst policy brief, they estimated that the increased labor costs for restaurant could be mitigated by a menu cost increase of 1 to 2%. Now, we can say that a menu increase of 2% is a consequence of this, but if you look like the cost of absolutely everything has increased year after year, except
Mhm.
for the cost of workers' labor. And if you tell the average Massachusetts voter that, you know, their $50 tab at a restaurant on a weekend is now going to be 51, but the server that's waiting on them hand and foot for 1 to 2 hours was being paid $6.75 an hour and now is being paid $15 an hour, and they're going to see 100% of the tips that you leave them.
Yes.
I think Massachusetts voters would be okay with paying 1 to 2% more. It's really not that much, especially in the face of all of the inflation that we've seen,
Right.
that hasn't followed any wage increases. Uh,
Right.
One of the biggest responses I got while collecting signatures to get this initiative on the ballot in the first place was, that can't be right.
Mm.
675?
Mm.
Is that really like people until now, I think now, now we're all tuned into the election and all the ballot questions and um as we should be, but for a long time, people didn't know that unless you were in the industry, that this was allowed and this was common.
Absolutely. Again, before we go any further, I do want to remind our viewers here that you are listening slash watching the Cultural Connections podcast. We're live on Friday, October 25th, 2024. And we're talking about question 5 here on the Massachusetts ballot coming up on November 5th. And this is the question that is to a proposed law would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage and employer must pay a tipped worker. And we're joined by Grace McGovern, the lead organizer of the Yes on 5 and current tipped worker in Boston. My next question then to you is then is the fact is why now? What led to this whole idea of bringing this up now? Why not wait a couple years down the road and see what happens? Why now? What's the reason for bringing this up to the table now?
Because workers need a raise.
Hmm.
We've needed a raise. It's past time. It should have happened years ago. But we're up against the deep, deep pockets of the National Restaurant Association. And, to anyone who's saying it's too soon, workers like the cost of absolutely everything has increased and increased and increased, and it's going to continue. At my restaurant alone, I've seen the menu prices go up and up and up over the past year and a half, and nothing has been done to our paychecks. We still deserve to be able to afford to go out and eat and go out and afford to pay the same bills that everyone else in the state of Massachusetts has to pay. If someone's working 40 hours a week, it's not a radical idea that they should have enough money to pay their bills and not be worried about it.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense here. Then I guess let's look at this into a national picture. Do you see, and I asked this question in relation to question 4 into their context, is do you see this as something that eventually down the road, maybe 4 years from now, 8 years from now, whatever, should be brought into a national spotlight? And if so, how do we bring this into a national attention and make more national attention be brought into this instead of going at it state by state by state by state? How do we do that?
Yeah, I think absolutely it should be done on a national level. I mean, obviously, I'm very passionate about this and, not hiding my opinions, but I do know that there's a bill on the federal level being introduced, the Horsford bill. I believe it's called the TIPS Act, to end subminimum wages. But again, I know that the National Restaurant Association has lots and lots of money. I mean, it's every chain, every billionaire, the CEO of Denny's, the CEO of Olive Garden, all of them are against us and against their workers who sell their products. And even, as a tipped worker in Massachusetts, I have to get trained and verified to serve alcohol by a program called ServeSafe. I have to pay out of my own money to get qualified to serve alcohol and work in the state of Massachusetts. And ServeSafe, the training company that runs my modules to teach me how to sell people alcohol, is owned by the National Restaurant Association. Last year, there was an expose on the New York Times about how the National Restaurant Association uses servers' money unknowingly to the servers from legally requiring them to take these courses and paying for them through ServeSafe. They use the revenue from ServeSafe to unknowingly lobby against wage increases. Like it's a dirty, dirty game. And it's the same dynamic of every other movement of, the labor movement in general. It's workers versus their bosses. Every room I enter, every town committee meeting, every ballot question forum meeting, it's always myself or another worker or, a former tipped worker in Massachusetts, and then someone who owns a restaurant who just does not want to pay. So I know I went off on a tangent there, but I think absolutely it should be a national movement. Subminimum wages are a uniquely American problem. Anyone who's gone on vacation to Europe or anywhere else knows that tipping is not enforced as much. And, tipping is an actual gratuity. Servers and waiters are not looked down upon as an unskilled labor force. They are appreciated and valued, and they are paid a livable wage. And then gratuities are actual gratuities. And you don't have to, budget in a 20 to 30% tip every time you go out and eat. You can give them 5 to 10% and know that that's an actual just gift for their good service.
Absolutely. No, I hear with what you're saying. Then let me ask you this in a different. You keep bringing obviously back into the attention the national chain restaurants, and I'm curious to understand here then the difference of how this would impact let's say a chain restaurant like you mentioned, a Denny's, an Olive Garden, et cetera, versus the small little diner that you would that someone would go to. What would be the impacts between a national chain restaurant and someone that I mean, is there any difference in between the two that would be
I mean, the difference that's so frustrating is that these giant chain restaurants who are so opposed to this and pour so much money into campaigning against giving their workers raises could absolutely afford to make this switch. They could afford to make this switch tomorrow. And not see a dip in revenue. Maybe the CEO has to take a little bit of a pay cut, but they make millions and millions of dollars. So absolutely, it's going to be a lot easier for the chains to make this shift, which again is why it's so frustrating to see them so adamantly opposed. And I think, small businesses may have a harder time because they have, less revenue. They have, only one location likely. And the interesting thing is we have over 100 restaurants in Massachusetts who already practice one fair wage plus tips on top, who
Yeah,
are already paying at least a minimum wage. Some of them pay more to
right.
employers while competing with all of the rest of the restaurants in the state who pay, less than half of their wage cost,
Of
and they're
course.
doing fine. And all of these restaurants are small businesses,
Yeah.
and most of them are one location. Um,
Yes.
so it's all about valuing your employees. I mean, I think especially in small businesses and mom and pop shops and, like one place only diners, if you really spend the time in getting to know your employees and respecting them and creating a mutually beneficial relationship, you guys can take care of each other and you also can take care of your customers. Um, so it will be harder on the smaller businesses than it will be on the chains.
Mm.
But again, the restaurants who are already doing this, who are facing the giant competition, are the small businesses, are the ones who face a larger challenge. And they've seen the benefit in doing this anyways.
Absolutely. Well, as I always say, it's hard to believe how fast a half hour to 40 minutes of this goes by. And I think this has been very informative. I'd like to give you the final words here just to, again, reemphasize why you want voters to vote yes here on question 5.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me, Brian. I really want people to vote yes on 5 because it would end a very outdated system of legally allowing employers to underpay their customer facing employees, and a system that really makes already vulnerable workers vulnerable to a lot of really prevalent issues in the restaurant industry: wage theft, racial inequity, sexual harassment. Um, Passing a ballot question and giving people a little bit more in their base wage isn't going to solve all of these huge systemic issues, but it's a fantastic place to start. And we have to start making changes now. Workers want this, and it's fair for consumers too, who have been unknowingly forced to subsidize labor costs.
Right.
And again, it's also fair to the over 100 restaurants who are already practicing one fair wage in Massachusetts. The biggest thing that this would do is put a little bit more money into the pockets of the people who need it the most.
Absolutely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. If people want to learn more about Yes on 5 and the mission that you're trying to accomplish, is there anywhere where they can go online to find out more about it?
Absolutely. Yes on 5, number 5, ma.org. And Yes on 5 MA on Instagram and Facebook as well.
Perfect. We will have all of those links on the description in the all of the description in the description of all of the places where you find our podcast here. So if you don't remember that, don't worry. Just look for it in the link and look for it in the description, and we'll also obviously share those links on the social media pages as well. Well, again, thank you so much to Grace for joining me today. This has been another very informative discussion, and we thank everyone at home for watching. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes of the podcast, please feel free to reach out to me via email at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIV as in Victor, ES@gmail.com. We always are welcome to get your questions, comments, and suggestions for future episodes. Stay tuned again into next week as we continue the discussion on these ballot questions on Monday evening at around 7 p.m. We'll be live again here on YouTube with the no side here of question 5 to hear about, again, the whole purpose of these episodes is to be informative. We want to make clear here on the podcast that we are not taking one side over another. This is more for you, the listener, the viewer, to get informative information so you can make an informative decision. That being said, don't forget the election is on November 5th, Tuesday, November 5th. Early voting is now open. You can vote by mail as well. And so please remember to vote in the election on Tuesday, November 5th if you are eligible. And we will be continuing this discussion into next week. And if you have questions that you did not get answered, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll do our best to get those questions answered for you as well. For now, I'm Brian Ives. Thanks for watching the Cultural Connections podcast, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections Podcast.